All right, Barry, welcome to the show. I'm really excited to have you on here today. And we're going to talk about a lot of things, probably more than we have time for. Not in the least, we'll talk about The Unknown Adventure, your new book. We're also going to talk a lot about, I hope, storytelling and your very unique approach to it, especially with the way that you learned how to storytell, which was, if I read your book correctly, on an ocean, on a sailboat with a $5,000 camera in a pelican case that you were trying to save from the sea. And you're doing some internal searching at the same time you're trying to tell the story of your best friends. It's a wild ride. So thanks for being here today.
Michael, I am so happy to be here and connect with you and connect with your guests and your fellow Marines. As a veteran myself, it's an honor to be able to speak to these guys and be part of this podcast. So thanks for having me on.
So we're gonna definitely get into the book, and I'm gonna recommend that everybody read it. It's a great read. I normally This is actually the second book in as many weeks where I have not been writing notes down. I typically like to summarize what I read as I go along, and kind of jot notes so that I retain it better. But uh, I can't put it down. It's very enjoyable. It's extraordinarily well written, but it's also very accessible to every reader who is going through difficult times in their life, who is interested in great adventures, is paralyzed by fear. There's nothing in here that somebody can't connect to. So, but for those that haven't read it yet, if you could maybe just give me some background about the book, about your life, and the lens through which you're seeing the world, and then also how you're delivering that world to people through the films that you make.
Yeah, no, I mean, I like it all started about 8 years ago. The funny thing is I spent a lot of my life kind of being a little bit of a gypsy, a little bit of a vagabond. Out of college, I lived on a sailboat. And then in multiple times in my life, I took long trips for long periods of time, left employment, kind of borderline on homeless, and I did it on a shoestring budget. I didn't come from money. I didn't come from wealth. It wasn't justified, but I made those choices because I was so curious about the world and so curious about life that it was the only thing that made sense to me. And then, in my mid 40s, I had gotten married and had a son, and that kind of stuff was a little bit behind me, and I was more with my nose to the grindstone, trying to catch up from those years that I spent. And I started writing, and initially I started writing thinking like, well, I didn't invest in a career. Maybe this maybe this book will kind of be the payoff for that those lack of investment. But that's kind of what initially inspired it. And you'll find, and I don't want to what they call a spoiler alert. I don't want to give a spoiler alert, but you'll find really the deeper part of me as a storyteller as you reach the end in the final pages really kind of is the full circle of where my love for storytelling came from. But I'd always wanted to write. I always thought it was an amazing thing. It would be an amazing accomplishment to be able to encompass a story within a book, and also, and I always thought I was always intimidated by it, the idea of holding so many pages and so much information in kind of what I would say your mindscape of like your journey. But I sat down that one day, I wrote it, and I just committed to myself that I was not gonna stop until I finished it. And it was weekends and evenings and moments here and moments there where I would just keep working away at it and chipping on it and piecing the book together. And then at one point I ran into an editor who was like, "Bro, you just need to let it go. You need to turn it over." He like had to wrestle it out of my hands. I met this publisher, Peter Lopez with Publify, an awesome dude, and he basically wrestled it out of my hands, and we got it from there, and published it. And so that's kind of what gave birth to this. And the premise behind it was I wanted to take people along on a journey with me. I wanted to give people a front seat to kind of why I did it. And part of it was like I wanted the world to understand a little bit of why I did it. And even more personal than that, I wanted my parents and my family to understand it, because for years they didn't understand my choices. And I wanted to offer sense to kind of some of my what perceived to be like very impulsive choices. I wanted to show them the ladder of what drove me in that direction. But I wanted to take the reader along with me and kind of give them a front seat to kind of the struggles, the insecurities, the fears, and then like the ultimately the narrative that it took me to kind of uh, overcome a lot of my insecurities that I still battle with them all the time, but in some regard to drive my life course towards what I would say is a successful direction. I don't. Success is more there's this objective of success, but success is really the journey of how you experience life. And so that's kind of what I wanted to do. That was both the premise behind it and like the inspiration and what I wanted for the viewer.
Well, you feel the journey every step of the way. There's a couple of themes that run through the book. So it's funny that you talk about staring at this at hundreds of unwritten pages as you started this project, and being bewildered by the effort that's about to have to come forth to actually put everything out onto paper. And then of course all the insecurities that are incumbent with that. Is anybody going to read this? Is anybody going to care for it? Is my writing going to be well received? But the theme that runs throughout the book is that, at least when you were younger, but you tell a very vivid story early on about jumping off, I think, a 70-foot cliff into the water, and just kind of throwing all caution and risk to the wind, and getting into it. And multiple times throughout your book, you do that, and it's kind of like partway through the journey you realize what you've done to yourself, right? Whether it's on a months long sailing trip, a couple of weeks in, you describe in great detail the dream of what that would be like. It's sailboat magazines and beautiful beaches and hanging out with your friends in the sun, and then the challenge and the misery and the weight of the reality experience that you're going through seems to hit you, and yet, despite whatever insecurities you're going through, you manage to get through it. You manage to see it for the bigger picture. You manage to integrate the dream and the reality and live in the present. And I see that happening over and over again. So I don't know what you think about that. One of the things that we try to do in the podcast is talk about how do people learn, because in order to teach and coach and mentor other human beings, you've got to be reflective about those sorts of events, those sorts of experiences, and then pull out the mindsets or the habits or the qualities that enabled you to kind of get through those moments to get to the rich and deep experience that you had on the other end of it, without just quitting and going home, and then trying to pass those along to someone else who can pull from those insights and then be able to accomplish the same sorts of things. Is that
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying, and just so what you're talking about, this moment in the trip, I'd signed up for almost a 3 month long trip down the from San Francisco down to Cabo San Lucas on a 23-foot Islander Bahama. So you guys are Marines, you're men of the sea. You understand boats. That's a small boat, you know.
that's not a big boat?
No, it's not a big boat. It's a
Right.
very small boat. And I signed up for it with three of my buddies who we had been kind of taking these crazy trips for years, you know. And so yeah, and so the importance of that moment is like and I think anyone can relate to this. Like when you even signing up to be a Marine, like you probably, this is why marketing is so beautiful and so dangerous. You probably scroll through your head, who doesn't, like, I'm the guy who's going to be jumping out of the helicopter and the hero, right? I'm going to be the hero of the scene. I'm going to take on the challenges and come out victorious, and kind of stand on the podium while people cheer. That's the visual that everyone has of anything they take on in life. Everyone creates this internal narrative. And for me, for that trip, it was the romance of sailing. And if I say the word, if I could stand in front of any audience in the world and say, I took a sailing trip for 3 months, and in those words alone, they're going to go, wow, dude, that sounds amazing. Um, it was the reality of it was probably some of the most. I went through some of the biggest suffering that I've ever done, and some of the biggest highs that I've ever gone through. And to understand that, you'll have to read the book. I don't want to get, you have to understand, like, the weather, the Pacific. We left in the middle of February. We just my friend, I think, was a masochist who was the captain of the boat. And February is the winter, and the Pacific is cold. And then, that's when you get the big swells. Those were the big Alaskan storms that come out. So you're also, like, we're going around Big Sur and Point Conception, which are two very notoriously dangerous kind of points to navigate around, and then just the general suffering of being on a boat of that scale. You're not, and we were anchoring. We were doing the marinas on the coast, but once we got into Mexico, there were only like three marinas in Mexico. The rest of it's like anchorages. But we were trying to also, like, get out in Anchorage, so we went out to Santa Cruz Islands, and we were anchoring out there, and it was just getting the tar beat out of us. Some nights we didn't make it into the right cove, and we were getting storms and the swell coming into where we were anchored, and just no sleep at all. And so the point of that is like, I reached this moment, and I do think, like, in the book, that's kind of like a crux where I was faced with the reality of the trip, versus the idea of what I was. And that, for anyone that anyone that's trying to take on a dream, whatever it is, that moment where you are like, wait, the reality of what I signed up for versus the idea of what I signed up for are not aligning at all. And that is a big moment in in everyone's life. And that was something that I wrestled with, trying to understand for years, and I tried to articulate at some level in this book, which was just being that critical review of, like, of yourself, and being honest with yourself, and who you are, and which is another thing. Like, I was thinking about this. I was thinking about this conversation with you, and you and I had gone back and forth, and we talked about stories and narratives, and how to uh, the value of understanding how to tell a story, and like and I was thinking about the fact that we all are telling ourselves a story all the time. Like, your identity of who you think you are is a story that you're telling yourself. You may not realize it, but it's a story you're telling yourself, and it's built from childhood up. And where you're going and where you want to go with your life, like, is all attached to that story, that narrative. And for me, in that trip, like, I was kind of looking at, like, the story I'd told myself and the reality of the trip, and who I was as a person, and was I able to stick it through. And there was a couple times where I literally was thinking about, like, getting off the boat. And it was that kind of turning point where I accepted the reality that it became something far greater than I could have ever imagined. Greater because suffering might actually be the best gift that anyone can have in life. Because because what you don't realize about the value of suffering is, that's when you're actually learning. But that's also what's setting you up for the highs, right? The highs are so quick. They're just like a moment. But but you don't have them without going through the suffering and the lessons. And then you reach this point where you're like, this is why I went through all of this, and I could have never imagined this. And frankly, when I started the response to this, the I went sailing on a boat for 3 months, and what people imagine can't even compare to the experience, and will never compare. They'll never compare to like a whale. Like literally, I had a little baby gray whale swim under my feet while I was sitting on on a surfboard, and that's kind of in there, and that's in the documentary that I also made on this, which is on Amazon Prime and YouTube. But just to kind of close out my response here, yeah, that was a huge moment, and that it was an extremely valuable moment, and kind of like recognizing that's going to come in any decision, recognizing that you have to look at yourself honestly and look at what you thought and what is really happening, and then kind of being able to go forward from that, and accept kind of what it is, what life is a big piece to everything in life that you take on, and life in general. um yeah.
Yeah, I talked the guest that we had on that with the episode that posted last week with Tom Hathaway. He described that narrative as playing a movie in your head. That you're constantly playing a little movie in your head about who you are and what your life is, and that's the story that you're telling yourself. And I try to, when I mentor high school and college students, I try to warn them about being very mindful about the story that they're telling themselves. Because sometimes it's a great story and it's pushing you forward, but sometimes it's an absolute lie that you've convinced yourself is true. I know I did this when I was younger. I was not a natural runner. I don't know what that means exactly. I don't know what it means to be a natural runner, but I told myself I wasn't one. And when I joined the service, I had a hard time running. And every time we would go out, it would be painful and difficult, and I wouldn't enjoy it. And I would keep telling myself this story that I wasn't any good at it, and I didn't come natural to it. And that was a story that I couldn't escape from until COVID, to be honest with you. And I got in good enough shape, obviously, to be able to serve and to set the example as best I could. But it was during COVID when the gyms shut down, the pools shut down. I couldn't do kind of these other forms of working out that I enjoyed, and the only way to get out of the house was to go for a run. And so every day at noon, I'd go jog for 30 or 40 minutes. I learned to enjoy the suffering because the suffering came with sunshine and it came with some sense of freedom. And 4, 5, 6 months later, I was running distances in times that I would have flat out told you a year or two prior would not have been possible for me to do. So I had to break that. I had to break that narrative of myself. I like the experience that you talked about with the whale. I remember in a couple of pages after that, as you were reflecting on the boat, and I think you might have been filming yourself. I think this is in the documentary, but at least in the book, and I've got the sentence here. If you don't mind, I'd like to read from it. You
Yeah.
said there below deck, laughing, talking, and reading books were my two compadres. This and every moment with them on the trip was rare and unique. I realized with already half the trip having passed that these were the adventures that I had never experienced before and would never relive again. And that's an incredible couple of sentences there, because I think far too often people live in their stories. They live in their past story about what all the terrible things that have happened to them and how it's not fair and everyone else has an extra edge that I don't. And they live in their future stories of Fantasyland, of what they dream could be. And so few people rarely live in the present with all the attendant happiness and suffering that comes with it, right? And at least in that moment, you captured that, I think, brilliantly there. And it's something that I try to tell young folks to hold on to. So I just got done teaching at the Naval Academy for the last couple of years, and I was a midshipman there. I was a student at one point, and I remember another theme in your book is kind of bouts of depression, and I went through one myself there. I was not happy. I had enlisted in a time of conflict, and then here I was at the Service Academy, not deploying overseas where my buddies were, and I didn't feel fulfilled. I didn't feel this a deep sense of purpose and meaning in my life, and I was kind of lost while I was there. And a midshipman now asked me, well, what advice do you have about being here? And my biggest advice is to enjoy every second of being with the people that are around you who are going to be the greatest friends of your life, right? I mean, the people that I could have walked down the hall and in 10 seconds seen three or four or five people who are now lifelong friends. My kids call them uncle, right? They call them aunt and uncle today. And I didn't appreciate that I had that. I was too focused on what I thought I didn't have or what I thought I was missing at the time. So I
No,
definitely very much identified with all this.
I think you're talking about a common mistake that lots of humans make. Uh, and I still do it sometimes with my son. Like I got this, my son's 11 years old, and I used to catch myself when he was like even younger, kind of being super busy with stuff and just thinking like I'll have those moments with him later, right?
Yeah,
I'll find time for that stuff with him later. And I would have to grab myself metaphorically and even literally at some level and just say, dude, there's no later. Like he's going to be 3 years, 5 years old for a second. Like like there's no like coming back to this age. He's going to be around for a while, but like there's no later. So stop telling yourself later. Like you have to make essential decisions based on like things you have to tackle in your life. You can't like be consumed by the importance of the moment, which I think a lot of people live in the future and the past because the moment that is can be so overwhelming of life. The present can be so overwhelming and be so intense. It's so much more intense.
yeah,
Um, and I'm hearing you when you say like w- we in the book I tried to address this moment, and I think maybe you've passed it, but I tried to address this moment where um I recognized the power of my historical narrative. Like I had failed I had failed the strange crazy as it sounds, failing the third grade was a horribly traumatic experience for me. Like easily the most traumatic, and people have much worse experiences than I had, so I, I want to keep it within reason. But for me, it was a horribly traumatic experience to fail the third grade. Just shame, just deep shame and embarrassment. And I had to relive it for years because I had to go back. I stayed in a small private Christian school that my parents had us in, and a class of like 20 kids at best, maybe 15. And I always saw my other classmates all through elementary that in the class I was in. For years, I would return to like thinking to myself, I'm supposed to be in that class.
yeah,
Um, the point is I adapted this victim's mentality, which is fascinating. What happens is you attract people that support it, and when you repeat the failure, and again to your structure, to your recruits and to your students, uh, understand the heroes. I mentioned to you earlier, and I'll bring this full circle, so I'll put on pause for a second, like what I'm talking about with regards to the structure of my narrative, to pause and talk about the hero's journey, which is Joseph Campbell structured this, and it's for mythical stories, but it's incredibly applicable to the human experience because we all go through the hero's journey. I'll just do a quick summary: is you are called to action. You're called to something in your life. The Marines. You depart on your journey. You go to basic training. You meet friends, mentors, and enemies. Right? All can be. You can pick those out in your life, and you overcome obstacles. And everyone reaches a threshold going through for I went through the army basic training. I remember the threshold was when we went on our I think 3 or 4 day bivouac, and they kept us up all night. Literally, first during the day you're digging a hole. We're creating a perimeter. and we're digging a hole. What do they call them? Parapets, two-man parapets, 6 feet, two M16s, 6 feet deep, and then you create a crawl trench to your bunk, and you're trading spots all night, and you're holding duty. I got a great story. I don't want to completely derail of my drill sergeant catching me sleeping, and I'll just finish it since I'm on
Yeah,
it.
you
So he
have to
taught me.
now. It's too late. It's
Yeah,
too
I
late.
know
You
it was
got to
such
tell
it's,
it
it's
now.
such a
Yeah.
great story. It was like the second night I was so exhausted, um, everything I could do to stay awake. And I remember falling asleep, and he was an old Green Beret that served in Vietnam, and he was Drill Sergeant Gwynn was dude. This guy was making you didn't want to mess with Gwynn. He took I had my helmet on. He had taken my weapon away from me and used the butt of it and was waking me up against my helmet. And I came to, and when I came to, I was in a panic, and I'm looking for, I'm trying to figure out where I am, and I'm looking for my weapon, and he's like, leans down, gets in my ear, and he goes, he's like, he's like, if this were wartime, he's like, I would have killed you. No, wait, no, wait, I would have cut your throat so I could kill all your buddies. And I was like,
Ooh, that
oh
stings.
shit.
Yeah, that gets you deep.
Yeah, and then the next morning I'm in chow hall, and he's like, "Where's your red mark?" Because I was the first guy he caught, and after me, he got a red marker and started uh, and he didn't get me. So he's like, "I'm coming for you." So for the next 3 nights, dude, it was all I could do to just stay awake all night. Anyways, I completely derailed, but I was on this
You're good.
story
You're
of the
back to the
heroes.
hero's journey. That's right.
Yeah, the
Yep.
hero's journey, and thanks guys for listening. But in the hero's journey, you come to the threshold. And in that threshold, you either go forward and are changed, or you go back and kind of return where you were. And look, I want people to understand that as they begin to understand this, maybe now or in the future, going back is not the end of the world. But when you go back as a victim, and this is what victims do a lot, victims never cross that threshold. Victims get to that point and go, I can't do it. I'm paralyzed with fear. I'm going back. And what they'll find is they'll find that group of friends that have always been there, and they go, "Oh my God, this happened to me, and this happened to me." And those friends will go, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And they're the crutches. Now, those are good friends, but there's a whole psychological thing that's happening for them too. They're getting value from kind of being your crutch, and there's this whole relationship symbiosis that's happening there that you need to be aware of. And I wasn't, took years. And then, but if you go through that, you'll go into a place that you've never been before. It's the unknown. And so that hero's journey is so essential in life. And it took me years to figure that I was in this cycle of going, I can't do that because the kid in third grade couldn't do it. He failed, and my parents swept in and helped me and picked me up, and the teachers picked me up and they carried me along. And I kept saying, but I can achieve this. I want to achieve this. And I would keep coming to this point in my story and going, no, you can't. You can't. You failed. But see, what people don't realize is, and this is the point of the book, is failing forward is the victory. Failing is part of getting to the other side, right? No hero in any great mythical movie, Frodo, etc. Like you look at every time that they come to this major crux in the story, it's fraught with error, and the wizard falls into the pit, and he's partially responsible for it. And now he feels like he's failed, and his buddy's like, "We got to keep going, etc., etc." This is how life works. If
Yeah.
you go forward, you're going to fail forward. That's how you go forward. That's the pathology of life, and that's where success is through failure. But I guess I was telling all that to just say, like, that's kind of what I was trying to structure in those stories and those experiences. Um, and I was hearing you kind of highlight some of that, and I think it's super valuable for. That's a big reason why I wrote this. I'm like, look at all the times I completely screwed up, and I'm still screwing up. I'm screwing up literally today. I'm having failures that are just miserable. Right now, I'm in the midst of trials, right, that I literally am not going to fill your audience in, but I can assure you that are not impressive. And I can put a nice resume forward. I can put a nice post on Facebook, but let me tell you, folks, uh, anyone who's real about life will tell you that, like, no matter how higher you are on the podium, we're still like failing miserably and making tons of mistakes. And that's how I've always found, at least, you get through that abyss. You get
Yeah.
through the other side is keep failing forward.
No, I try to communicate the same thing. I think it's harder in a lot of ways for younger folks because they're so much inexperienced. There's so much inexperience there. They haven't seen a lot of the world in many cases, and the rate of failure is just going to be higher at their younger ages, right? And so you see somebody who's older, who's experienced some success. You typically don't see all the failures that are behind them. You don't see the failures that they're going through kind of concurrently. And it's very difficult to get through to get through the threshold. And
Yeah.
the way that I try to frame it for young folks is that failure is a cheat code. It's it would be like if so my experience is predominantly in academics. You get somebody who gets a C or a D on an exam, or occasionally a very high achiever who's very upset with a B plus or an A minus, right? And they're going through this for them in that moment an acute sense of failure or inability. And I try to remind them that number one, a point failure says nothing about your capability. We all have the ability to miss questions on a test or to have a bad day. It says nothing about what you're capable of. It just said in that moment, on that day, on that test, you didn't get it. And the other side of that is that what you've just been handed by the universe is a cheat code to what you need to fix and what you need to work on and what you need to focus on. If I'd come to you the day before the exam and said, hey, you're going to miss these 4 problems, you would be ecstatic. That would be the greatest information that could possibly be given to you because you now know exactly what you need to study. And so after the exam, get over the hurt and the burn of and the shame maybe of the poor grade or the missed goal, but it's the same information, it's the same cheat code. You now know what it is that you need to work on going forward. And I know that it's difficult to do that in the moment, but I find, like most things, it takes practice, and if you practice it, it becomes a habit where you can fail forward, and get used to it because it's gonna be a part of your life for a long time. So
Oh, it is a part of life, and I think that's why very successful people say learn to get over those moments as
exactly,
quickly as possible and go forward.
take a deep breath, move
Yeah,
on.
if
Yeah,
you're going in an obstacle course and you like bumble like a section, pick yourself up as quick as possible and keep moving forward. You might still make the cutoff time. You know what I mean?
yeah, yeah,
And I think that's the that's the practical. I love practical examples that apply to life because like because you can you can put that in your mindscape and go, oh yeah, I get it. You know what I mean? And I think that's the practical piece of that. It's just you got to recover quickly. You got to pick yourself up, get the mud off, and keep moving forward.
yeah. I do want to ask one more question on this topic before we go into how you learned how to story tell, right? How you learned how to make documentaries, and then in turn what you try to teach the audience, and then I think you have an adjunct professor position coming up that you're preparing for, and so how you might adapt your techniques and your narrative structures to the classroom instead of the silver screen. But the last question I wanted to ask real quick was, you talk about in the book multiple areas where the third grade failure kind of trauma came back to bite at you and maybe sometimes prevent you from getting over the threshold. But in maybe like 2 paragraphs, you talk about your Army experience. It might have been slightly longer than that, but it wasn't a huge portion of the book. And you talk about going to AIT, Advanced Individual Training, I think is what the Army calls your job school. And you were top of your class as in some sort of electrician role or function, right? And
I
so
loved that job actually. Yeah.
and so I'm just curious if that why is it you've had these very different experiences of failing the third grade, but then being the top of your class in a difficult MOS in the Army, and yet one of those stuck with you to maybe sometimes pull you back from the threshold instead of having the other be the story that you tell yourself to push you over it. Is it? I don't know if
No,
that's
that
something
makes
that.
sense. No, it's funny that you say that. And in the end of the book, kind of I come full circle to exactly what you're saying, which is recognizing what you're good at and celebrating it instead of sulking on all the things you're not good at and trying to get better at things that you're horrible at. You know what I mean?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah.
I spent a lot of my life focusing on the wrong things, and it took me a long time. Again, like I don't want to spoil the book, but to come to that place. And I mean, it was funny for years. I did do that. Like I think that humans by and large are in love with the idea of getting better at the things they're weak at, which I think
Mm-hmm.
is a strong suit. But I think it's important to recognize like you're the people who become pros, and I mean like high performers, usually do that, get to there because they go, I'm really good at this. I'm just going to focus at what I'm really good at. I think a lot of my life I've made a little bit of the mistake of going, I'm going to focus at what I'm not good at and get better at it. And that can hold you back, although you might end up being a more rounded person, so there's probably more value, there's some value there. But yeah, I think it took me a long time to come to that, recognize that like I don't need to be a masochist. That I can accept that maybe accept the things that I'm good at and follow them. Why I didn't. I still do tons of electrical work around the house. I love working with my hands, and I still do a little bit of it applies universally in what I do now because I work with a lot of electronical equipment and the cameras and editing and different things. So I still kind of am around that, and that stuff comes naturally to me.
Yeah.
But the academia for me, I think it was such a painful rejection that I'm like, no, I'm going to prove the world wrong. I'm not a
Yeah.
failure in academia. Nah, screw you guys. Like I'm gonna surpass you. And and you mentioned the adjunct role, and I'm very proud that and when it's not official yet. When I get my first class, I'll definitely be very proud that I'm like I'm working at a collegiate level, and
Yeah.
everyone expected me to kind of perform at a much lower level than this. Let's just say that because I think everyone. I don't want to be disparaging to where people are in life because I think anything you do you should be proud of. But yeah, so
Yeah.
that's
So let's jump in then to how you learned what you're good at, which is a documentary filmmaking. And you'd been kind of in and out of filmmaking as a production assistant. You were an extra in a few different things, but it was that sailing trip where you decided that you were going to make a documentary film. And I just want to quote again from your book here. You said, I wanted to direct documentary films, so I decided to go on this trip, and I needed to go as a filmmaker to do that. I needed to become a professional in my craft, but at this point in my life, I was not re enrolling in an institution of higher learning. I didn't want the conformity or the debt associated with it, so instead I decided to subsidize my education. I would sidestep the system and enroll in the School of Hard Knocks. I was going to be self taught, and this trip was going to be my first course in the program. I've got there's more episodes coming with some other folks that I've talked to recently that have done this sort of generative learning. Generative learning is where you dive into it and you are going to make a ton of mistakes because you don't have the formal course instruction, you don't have a textbook, and yet the folks that go through generative learning tend to, and this is anecdotal, I don't have evidence or data for this to back it up, but seems to me to be the best at what they do, right? Struggling through it, getting through all the failures that we talked about. Those are lessons that really stick with you when you learn them in real life. So maybe if you could walk me through what was that like to learn by doing? What were the challenges involved as you figured out how to make a film, how to make a film that somebody wanted to watch that was interesting? And then when it was in the editing process, which I think took you 15 years, if I remember correctly, after all the footage was done, what was that like piecing through 100 hours of footage and trying to craft a story and a narrative that people were going to connect with and understand, and then be true to the experience that you and your friends had?
well, yeah. And I have a lot of thoughts in that space. I love the fact that you called it generative learning. I've never had a term for it. Now I feel like it's far more official than me just kind of hacking away at life, bootstrapping it, bootstrapping my way through. I love generative learning. That's an amazing term. I kind of have lost faith in the institution. My experience with uh in school created a lot of skepticism with the institution, going through institutional learning. And also because I came from, my dad worked in a steel foundry, my mom drove school bus. We were a very blue collar working class family from the Midwest. Financially, I was not in a position where I could kind of whimsically go, well, I spent my GI Bill on this I'm for my BA on this topic, but I want to go to another one. I'm just gonna, jump into it and go into a bunch of debt. And I didn't want to go into debt. And so I had kind of come to this place in life where I believed, and at some level, I still believe this within reason. Like, I wouldn't encourage doctors or lawyers to take this path. And I do think there are some trades that need to go through institutions. But I,
Sure.
I think there's a lot of value in recognizing that, and I think a lot of people believe this is like you can kind of, you have to step into a role and believe that you are that at some level before you get there. So if you're looking to become a head of a platoon or lead I'm forgetting a lot of the military terminology, but lead kind of your brigade or whatever. I'm just messing up terminology. Sorry guys, please excuse me. I've been out for 20 years. Um, but if that's your goal, you first need to start acting like a leader. You need to like show up top of the line, have your shoes polished, be thinking like a leader structurally. And that's kind of where my mind was when I decided to do this. And that's kind of what that line that you read was about was I believe that I could be a director. I believe that I could kind of create my own documentaries. And I believe the best way to do that, since I wasn't going to go in debt and go back to college, was just to like, I was going to buy the camera. I was going to start. You started this question with documentary films that I'm good at. I will say I was not good. I was horrible. I had no clue what I was doing. Literally, I consumed a ton of Netflix, and this was back when Netflix would ship you DVDs.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. In the mail. Yeah.
yeah, it was kind of a cool era though, because I felt like you had Netflix at that time would let anyone submit. And I felt
Okay.
like they were a legitimate library of independent work, where now they're kind of a mainstream kind of funnel of content. So it was
Yeah.
fine. That's their bread and butter. They've become very wealthy because of it. But in the process, back in the day, you could really get some cool independent doc films from just random people, and random people could just submit them. I have buddies that had films on the platform because they got them in back in '08 or something.
Yeah.
Um, but so I just consumed ton, and I bought the equipment and just it was a bumpy road. And the reason it took 15 years, and there were other films that came before that, and there was an experience that I had. I lived in Italy for a little while. That's where my wife is from, and
Yeah.
that's in the book as well. And I think you'll enjoy that piece as well. But without going down that road too much, there were two young filmmakers in Italy that had made a film in Alaska, and I had, by the time I met them, I had taken the sailing trip, I had recorded it, I had gone on another trip to Hawaii and filmed a friend who ran an ultra marathon called the Hurt 100. I had landed a job, and this was visualization. I believed I could do it. I took the trip, I started shooting, I bought the camera, and because of that, I landed a job producing for Nat Geo and Animal Planet. I produced a documentary called Defying Niagara of people going over Niagara Falls, which is in the book, and me uncovering these guys was a fascinating piece that I'm sure you'll enjoy. And then I did a show for Animal Planet where I shot 56 episodes of the Weird, True, and Freaky, which is a show that I'm sure nobody that's listening to this has ever seen because it's so unpopular. But I don't know if it's unpopular. It's 10 years old and it wasn't that great. But you can Google it, you'll find it. But the point is I've had all those experiences. I'm still scared to death to actually show anybody my work. I had captured all that. I'd edited it forever. I was scared to death. And I sat
Yeah.
with these two Italian guys who had no clue what they were doing, but they weren't afraid. They weren't afraid to go in front of people and fail and be embarrassed. And what's amazing
Yeah.
is humans are actually very compassionate and caring. And even with my book, like I was so scared to put this out, but I've gotten so much support. And so I did, and that's kind of how, I'm kind of drifting a little bit, but that's kind of how that came about. I feel like I've kind of gone off your question a little bit there, but that's how the documentary filmmaking and the storytelling, and it took years to shape it.
Yeah.
Trial and error. I just finished a film recently about a guy biking across the country, which I would encourage everybody to watch. It's on Prime. It's called Crossing Lines: An American Ride, and I encourage troops to watch it because it's really an endorsement of America. And I talk to all these great Americans as I cross the country, who have all these great opinions of our country. And this was during a time when, we went through this kind of like crazy period where it seemed like there was so much anti Americanism,
Yeah.
and I just and it wasn't real. It wasn't real. And I was like, I just want to talk to people on the street. And there's people love this country. You get out in the rural areas, people love this country, and it's such an awesome country. But anyways, I'm off track, but the stories keep shaping. And then this documentary, I worked on it for 2 years, and I still look at it and I'm like, God, I wish I would have done this different. So it's always a process.
Yeah.
Um, um, and yeah, so that's kind of the documentary piece. I feel like I kind of was open ended on that answer, but
No, you
hopefully
no
there's
you
something in
you
there.
answered it in several different ways. I mean, the things that I draw out of that are, number one, you're going to be really really bad at most of the things that you start doing, right?
Yeah,
You're going to be bad at it, and you either love the thing so much and you pour everything you have into it that you eventually become good at it, or you give up and you move on. But the people that are good at anything spent years being probably pretty trash at it,
yeah.
right? And I don't think folks realize that you're gonna have to spend a lot of time, being embarrassed or getting over those feelings and failing forward, like we said earlier. The other thing that I think I drew out of your discussion there is that you've got to pour everything that you have into it, and you have to live it and you have to breathe it all the time, right? It's not just that you were learning as you went along, but you were watching the Netflix DVDs and you were seeking out mentors. And even though it wasn't a formal classroom, you were talking to other documentary filmmakers. You were figuring out what they did right, what they did poorly. And then maybe the last thing that I think I drew from all of that is that you're going to be your own worst critic, 100%. And you're gonna have to get over that at some point and just put it out there, because it's not ever going to be perfect in your own eyes, this thing that you're trying to create. So
Yeah, no, I mean, the first project I showed in public, like I shrunk in my seat. I just wanted to hide.
yeah.
And people enjoyed it, but it was so painful. And I still feel a little uncomfortable at times, even selling the book, which is about me. I'm like, God, I'm not that important. But I got to remember, like my purpose and my mission behind it is like helping other people see the human experience that's relatable to their life and take away things that can help them. For the classroom element that you said, and
Yeah.
I started to and that's kind of where I lost track of my response. And I would add this, I was a little anti-institutional, but I think that was a mistake at some level. Um, and I remember a long time ago, I went to Yosemite and Half Dome. I don't know if any of your viewers or
Hmm.
if you've climbed Half Dome. It's kind of a long
Yeah.
hike. Yeah, it's a really cool spot. It's a long hike, and at the end, there's kind of like this cable step ladder that you go up, and it's kind of sketchy. You put gloves on, but it's also a very cool experience.
Yeah.
And I got up there, and I remember one day I remember when I was up there, I watched guys coming up the face, rock climbers. So cool and so sketchy. And I feel like I chose the route of this kind of bootstrapping my way into this industry. I kind of chose the route of climbing the face. It's very difficult, lots of failure, big falls, and a lot harder to get there. And I still feel like I have a long ways to go. I feel like education is that path that's a little bit smoother, the grades a little bit safer, and the chances of you reaching your objective is there's a much higher a likelihood. And so I would encourage anyone, that's hearing my story, I would say, you know, go back to school, figure out a way to kind of integrate the lessons that I learned and my way of getting there, but take the pathway of kind of higher learning. It'll set you up, on a much better path. I feel like I have gotten beaten. I've just taken like such a. It's been a slog at some level. So
Fair enough.
That's my last piece on that.
Well, that's a good takeaway. I've been in kind of education spaces for a really long time. I love teaching. I enjoy very much being a student, and I do think that there's a lot that folks can take away from higher education, but both routes have pros and cons, and you have to weigh them out for yourself. So, those things that you can't afford to fail, doctors, right, lawyers, the kind of
Yeah.
the professions you mentioned earlier, go get some training, do that right. If it's a hobby that you think might be a passion, before you go unload your bank account, dive into it with everything you have. And when you hit the wall, if you push through the wall, this thing's for you, then it's time to invest. If you hit the wall and go, you know what, this is miserable. I'm not having fun. I'm not willing to go through the difficulty and the challenges where I come out good on the other end. Maybe there's another option for me. Perhaps you can learn that less painfully or less expensively
Well,
through that
and
area.
and just to complement what you're saying there's another part of me that for years I would listen to the Tony Robbins and the different motivational speakers, which are not to discount what they offer. They're very valuable, but they would rev me up on this burn the boats and take the island mentality, right?
Yeah,
And you better know yourself very well before
I
you
would
do that. Like the one thing
very
that
much
they
agree.
don't say is like, know yourself well and how you're going to respond. Because burning the boats and taking the island, I kind of took a little of that path. And I look around and I have seen people that do that successfully. But you better know yourself well. And what I didn't really account, and again, back to our conversation of our narrative of who we are versus the reality of who we are, is now looking at my life, I look at the fact that I'm a little ADHD, so I'm a little fractured sometimes in my thinking. I'm a little bit of a creative, so I'm not the kind of guy that's going to wake up every morning. My wife is a schedule person. She'll wake up every morning at the same time. She'll execute on perfect time her entire day, and she'll go to bed at the same time, and she'll sleep. That's my wife will do that 7 days a week and not even think about it. I'll lose my mind. I'm like a little bit all over. Every day has to be a little different, or I kind
Yeah,
of come undone. And I'm also, when I look at the compass of my life or the spectrum of my life, if I'm honest with myself, I'm a middle of the packer. You know, you say, yeah, I do good films, and I appreciate it, and I'll accept it. But I'm middle of the pack. I'm middle of the pack, and anyone who's a runner, and you're a runner, you understand that term. There's front of the if you're running a marathon, there's front of the pack, middle of the pack, and back of the pack. I'm a middle of the packer. So if I'm burning the boats and taking the island like I'm a front of the packer, a routine guy that's going to bust it out every day, front of the pack, and going to excel and reach that peak, I'm setting myself up for failure, right?
yeah,
And so
yeah,
know yourself. And the way you know yourself is you look around and be honest of where you're landing. I look back at my test scores in high school, I look at my test scores in college, my performance and my jobs, et cetera, et cetera. It's not always easy to sit and turn and look at yourself and go, God, I'm kind of average. And that is
yeah,
not an easy thing to be real about. But you have to be real, and from that place you can lean into that, you can make the best of that, you can excel in that space. But if you're not honest with yourself and you're taking on all these motivational things, and you're setting yourself up, and you can be more successful by being smarter and more rational about those terms and those. And so yeah, that's my last piece that I would add to kind of what you were saying.
Well, that's great advice and a great takeaway. I want to finish up here with, well, first of all, my thanks for coming on and chatting with us today and with the listeners. And I want to give you a chance to plug your book properly. I'm going to do it for you. The book came in. We rushed our recording of this session because I had someone drop out and you were available and we filled it in.
Thanks. I'm glad to be
And
here.
I'm very happy to have done this, but this book showed up at 10 o'clock last night, and I am 8 chapters into 12 in just the 12 hours that I've had it minus the sleep time, because I couldn't put it down. It's thoroughly enjoyable. Like I said, there's nothing in there. Someone's going to connect. Any reader's going to connect with a lot of what you'd written about, and So anyway, please tell us the title, what you try to offer in it. The floor is yours to wrap this up here.
Yeah, no, The Unknown Adventurer. It is available on Amazon and Book Barnes and Nobles, and not yet on Audible, but it will be in the coming year. And it is, it is an adventure. It is an adventure of the stories of my life that'll take you from my small town in the Midwest to my trips out to California and Hollywood, and the bunch of trips I took along the coast, and my marriage, and ultimately to the Himalayas of India, where I kind of I think is was kind of the summit of my work in documentary films, and a lot of those lessons and mistakes along the way of kind of impulsively taking risks and jumping into things without completely being aware of what I was getting into, and the takeaways from those moments. So I think it's an inspirational book. I hope it like brings something to the lives of people who read it, and would love to hear from people if they do read it and hear their thoughts on it.
Well, I absolutely agree, and Barry, I really appreciate your time spending a few minutes with us today and talking through, how you learn, how you fail forward, and can't wait to see what comes for you next.
Thank you. I'm so glad we did this, and I look forward to kind of seeing this live and staying in touch.
Sounds good.